On a night meant to celebrate achievements and hide scars, a lonely billionaire and a homeless mother cross paths in the unlikely setting of a luxurious gala hall. He seeks redemption in grand gestures. She, just a safe harbor to protect her son. But what begins as a meeting of opposite worlds soon turns into a journey of painful discoveries, revealed secrets and unlikely bonds that challenge the power of the past. Amid betrayals, twists, and the fight for truth, this powerful story explores how love and courage can transform even the most broken destinies, creating a future where forgiveness and hope triumph. The golden light poured through the large windows of the ballroom at the Plaza Hotel in New York City, reflecting off the crystal glasses and the polished smiles of the guests. Edward Montgomery, at 45, watched the celebration of his latest philanthropic project with a distant gaze. Dressed in an impeccable tuxedo that accentuated his elegant posture, he maintained a rehearsed smile on his lips, while his heart carried a weight that none of his business achievements could ease. The New Dawn Institute, his most recent charitable initiative, was yet another attempt to fill the void left by the departure of Eleanor, his wife, 3 years ago. The people around him saw him as an example of resilience, a successful businessman who dedicated his fortune to noble causes. Little did they know that each charity project was a desperate way to give meaning to an existence that seemed to have lost its compass. "Mr. Montgomery, could you share a few words about tonight?" asked a young reporter, approaching with a microphone in hand. Edward adjusted his bow tie and responded with the diplomacy that years of public life had taught him. The New Dawn Institute represents more than a social project. It is a commitment to those who need a second chance in life. His deep voice echoed through the hall as the cameras captured every word. "I believe everyone deserves dignity and opportunities." Amid applause and camera flashes, Edward managed to escape to the hotel's balcony. The gentle breeze of the New York night slightly ruffled his graying hair at the temples, while his brown eyes gazed at the moonlit Manhattan beach. It was then that Marianne Thompson, his chief executive and right-hand woman for over a decade, appeared by his side. "You shouldn't hide from your admirers, Edward," she said, her red dress contrasting with the night. "This is your night of triumph." Marianne was a shrewd woman who had climbed the corporate ladder with fierce determination. At 38, she ran the operations of Montgomery Enterprises with impressive efficiency. What few noticed was the different sparkle in her eyes when she was near Edward, a mix of admiration and something deeper that she carefully kept hidden. "I need to personally check on the Institute's opening," Edward replied, glancing at his wristwatch. "The cameras and speeches are important for publicity, but what really matters is happening there." The New Dawn Institute, located on a vast property in Brooklyn, was set to officially open that night. Edward made a point of heading to the site, leaving behind the glamour of the party. Marianne watched him leave, a flicker of concern crossing her face. During the ride in his armored Mercedes, Edward reflected on the empire he had built. Montgomery Enterprises was a conglomerate spanning from construction to technology, employing thousands of people. But his latest acquisition, the renewable energy startup Ecotech, was proving more troublesome than anticipated. The numbers didn't add up, and there were rumors of irregularities that could jeopardize his entire business group. Upon arriving at the Institute, the modern and welcoming facade contrasted with the commotion forming at the entrance. A group of people was arguing with the security guards, and at the center of the chaos, a young woman firmly held the hand of a boy around 6 years old. "I already said we can't take anyone else today," shouted one of the staff members, his voice filled with impatience. "The official opening is tomorrow." The woman, despite her simple and worn clothes, maintained a dignity that caught Edward's attention. Her green eyes, though clearly tired, shone with fierce determination. The boy beside her, with messy dark hair, clung to her tightly. "Please, we just need a place to stay for the night," she argued, her voice steady despite the situation. "My son is hungry, and they said this place would help people like us." Edward felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced in a long time. There was something familiar about that woman, something that went beyond her apparent fragility. Without a second thought, He stepped out of the car and walked toward the group. "What's the problem here?" "Mr. Montgomery!" His authoritative voice made everyone turn. The employee immediately straightened up upon recognizing him. "Mr. Montgomery! We were just following procedures. The official opening is tomorrow. And this institute was created precisely for situations like this," Edward interrupted, shifting his gaze to the woman and the child. It was then that he noticed a delicate necklace around her neck, an antique piece that seemed out of place compared to her other clothing. Juliet Sanders instinctively clutched the necklace between her fingers, a habit she had whenever she felt nervous. The elegant man in front of her watched with a mix of curiosity and compassion that made her uncomfortable. After years on the streets, she had learned to distrust kindness. Every gesture of apparent generosity usually came with too high a price. "What's your name?" Edward asked, his voice softer now. "Juliet," she replied hesitantly. "And this is my son Lucas." The boy partially hid behind her, his big, curious eyes shifting between his mother and the well-dressed stranger. Edward crouched down to Lucas's level, a gesture that surprised Juliet. "Hello, Lucas. You must be hungry, aren't you?" The boy nodded timidly. "How about we all go inside and find something to eat?" The employee who had previously barred them now scrambled to apologize, stepping aside to let them through. Juliet hesitated for a moment, but the gentle squeeze of Lucas's hand in hers made her move forward. The interior of the institute was welcoming, with walls in light tones and an atmosphere that tried its best to distance itself from institutional coldness. In the industrial kitchen on site, Edward personally ensured that mother and son received a hot meal. While Lucas devoured his plate with the characteristic appetite of childhood, Juliet merely pushed her food around, her watchful gaze never leaving her son. "How long have you been on the streets?" Edward asked, sitting down at the table with them. Juliet tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, momentarily revealing a small scar near her temple. "A few months," she replied vaguely, "but we manage well." The pride in her voice was evident. Edward noticed that despite their circumstances, there was a natural elegance in her gestures, as if at some point in her life she had known a reality, very different from the current one. The antique necklace around her neck, with its intricate design, only reinforced this impression. "The institute is still in the process of being organized," he commented, watching Lucas as he now played with the last piece of bread on his plate. "But I have a proposal for you." Juliet immediately tensed up. "I have a house that's too big for just one person. I can offer you a place to stay temporarily until you get settled." "Why?" Juliet asked directly, her green eyes fixed on his. "Why would a man like you care about people like us?" The question hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. For a moment, the image of Eleanor appeared in his mind. She would have done exactly the same thing. "Because sometimes," he replied after a pause, "helping someone is also a way of helping yourself." At the Montgomery mansion, located in the Upper West Side, Marianne awaited news of the inauguration party. Something deep inside her told her that this night would be different. Her fingers drummed nervously on the mahogany desk in her office as she reviewed the latest reports from Ecotech. The numbers were concerning. The acquisition that was supposed to be Edward's greatest triumph was turning out to be a ticking time bomb. Marianne had warned him about the risks, but he was determined to expand into the renewable energy sector. Now the consequences were beginning to surface. Her phone buzzed with a message from Edward. "I need you to prepare 2 guest rooms. I'm bringing visitors." Marianne felt her stomach churn. She had known Edward long enough to recognize his occasional impulsive acts of charity, but something about that message deeply unsettled her. With trembling fingers, she opened her contact list and searched for a number she hadn't used in a long time. "Dr. Richard, I need your help," she said into the phone, her voice low and controlled. "Yes, it's about Edward Montgomery. I think he might be making a mistake we need to prevent." On the other end of the line, Richard Mendelsohn, one of the most influential lawyers in New York City, smiled discreetly. He had been waiting for an opportunity like this for years. His office in Long Island, adorned with priceless works of art, held secrets that could destroy many lives, including that of the mysterious woman Edward had just taken in. Meanwhile, in the car on the way to the mansion, Juliet gazed at the illuminated city through the window, the heavy necklace around her neck a constant reminder of her past. The inscription on it, which she had never fully deciphered, seemed to burn into her skin. To my dear daughter, the truth is kept where the sun rises twice, MS. Lucas had fallen asleep in the back seat, his soft breathing the only sound inside the vehicle. Juliet allowed a single tear to roll down her cheek, quickly wiping it away before Edward could notice in the rearview mirror. That night, for some reason she couldn't yet understand, felt like the beginning of something that would change her life forever. The Montgomery mansion stood imposingly against the starry sky of New York City. Juliet, with Lucas asleep in her arms, couldn't hold back a gasp of awe as she passed through the wrought iron gates. The meticulously maintained garden was illuminated by soft lights that cast dancing shadows among the ancient trees. Marianne awaited them at the top of the marble staircase, her red dress replaced by an elegant social ensemble. Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she greeted the newcomers. "Edward, what a surprise! Interesting," she said, sizing Juliet up from head to toe. "The rooms are prepared as you requested." "Thank you, Marianne," Edward replied, guiding Juliet and Lucas inside. "This is Juliet and this is her son Lucas. They'll be staying with us for a while." The interior of the mansion was even more impressive. Classic paintings adorned the walls, and a crystal chandelier dominated the entrance hall. Juliet felt out of place, her simple clothes in stark contrast to the luxury surrounding her. Lucas, who had woken up during the commotion, looked around with wide-eyed fascination. "Mary!" Edward called, and a middle-aged woman promptly appeared. "Please, show Juliet and Lucas to their rooms, and arrange for new clothes for both of them first thing tomorrow morning." "Right away, sir," replied Mary, with a gentle smile that made Juliet feel slightly more at ease. As they ascended the stairs, Marianne pulled Edward into his office. "Edward, we need to talk about Ecotech. The situation is more complicated than we anticipated." In the room designated for them, Juliet laid Lucas down on the enormous king-size bed. The boy, still drowsy, smiled as he felt the softness of the Egyptian cotton sheets. "Mom, it feels like a cloud," he murmured before falling back asleep. Juliet walked to the window, gazing at the illuminated gardens below. Her reflection in the glass made her unconsciously touch the scar near her temple, a constant reminder of her last night at the orphanage, so many years ago. The necklace around her neck glimmered softly in the room's light. In the office, Marianne was presenting Edward with a series of concerning documents. "The investors are nervous. The stocks dropped 15% just this week. If we don't find a solution quickly, we could lose everything." Edward massaged his temples, feeling the weight of his worries mounting. "There must be something we can do. Ecotech has potential. We just need time." "Time is a luxury we don't have," Marianne replied, her voice filled with urgency. "And now you're bringing strangers into your home. Edward, you need to focus on what really matters." "Don't tell me what matters, Marianne," he responded, his voice firm. "I've spent the last 3 years focused solely on business, trying to fill a void that only grows. Maybe helping that family is exactly what I need right now." Marianne looked at the man before her, feeling her heart tighten. For years she had harbored feelings for Edward, patiently waiting for him to move past the loss of Eleanor. Now a stranger threatened to destroy everything she had planned. In her room before going to sleep, she made another call. "Doctor, Richard, I need you to investigate someone for me. A certain Juliet Sanders. There's something about her that doesn't sit right with me." In the mansion's library, Edward found himself unable to sleep. His eyes wandered across the shelves until they landed on a photo album. As he opened it, he came across a picture of Eleanor in front of an orphanage, smiling as she hugged a group of children. His heart skipped a beat when he noticed something familiar in the background of the image. A girl with intense green eyes wearing a necklace he would recognize anywhere. In the guest room, Juliet was also awake. Lucas was fast asleep, while she examined the necklace under the light of the lamp. The inscription, partially faded by time, held a secret she had been trying to decipher for years. "Where the sun rises, twice." What did her mother mean by that? In Long Island, Richard Mendelsohn was working late in his office, On his desk, an old folder contained documents that could change many lives. Among them, a birth certificate with the name Juliet Mendelssohn Sanders and a stock purchase agreement dated 20 years ago, signed by M. Sanders. The lawyer smiled, savoring a sip of his whiskey as he typed on his computer. On the screen, an old headline caught his attention. Businessman Marcus Sanders and wife disappear in helicopter accident. Only daughter sent to state orphanage. Morning arrived at the Montgomery mansion, bringing a different atmosphere. Juliet woke up with the first rays of sunlight and found on an armchair several bags with new clothes for her and Lucas. Mary, the housekeeper, had followed Edward's instructions to the letter. "Mum, look at this," Lucas exclaimed, already wearing a new t-shirt and jeans. His eyes sparkled with excitement, as if he were living a dream. Juliet smiled, but her heart was heavy with the awareness that this reality was temporary. Downstairs, Edward was having his breakfast when Marianne arrived, carrying a thick folder of documents. "Good morning," she said, sitting down across from him. "I have news about Ecotech, and you're not going to like it." "Can it wait a moment?" Edward asked, his eyes fixed on the staircase where Juliet and Lucas were descending. Juliet looked different in her new clothes, a simple yet elegant dress that accentuated her natural beauty. For a moment, Edward felt transported back in time, remembering the first time he saw Eleanor. "Good morning," Juliet greeted timidly. Lucas ran up to Edward, momentarily forgetting his initial shyness. "Mr. Edward, look what Mary brought for us." The boy excitedly showed off his new clothes. Edward smiled, feeling a tenderness he hadn't experienced in a long time. Marianne watched the scene with a mix of irritation and concern. Her phone buzzed with a message from Richard. "I've found some interesting information about our guest. Can we meet today?" During breakfast, Juliet noticed Marianne's glances and felt uneasy. Years on the streets had given her a sixth sense for detecting veiled hostility. "We need to talk about your plans," Edward said gently to Juliet. "How about we take a walk in the garden after breakfast?" In Richard Mendelssohn's office, the lawyer was carefully organizing his findings: old photos of the Sanders couple, newspaper, clippings about the accident, documents from the orphanage, everything connected like pieces of a sinister puzzle he himself had helped create 2 decades ago. "Mr. Richard," his secretary interrupted his thoughts. "Mrs. Marianne Thompson has arrived." Marianne entered the luxurious office, her posture revealing the tension she carried. "What did you find out about her?" Richard smiled, a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Juliet Sanders is not just a simple street dweller, my dear. She is the heiress to one of the largest industrial empires in the United States, or rather she was." In the gardens of the mansion, Edward and Juliet walked side by side, while Lucas played with a dog that belonged to the house, a golden Labrador, named Max. "You have a wonderful son," Edward commented, watching the boy. "He's all I have," Juliet replied, unconsciously touching her necklace. Edward noticed the gesture. "That necklace, it looks old." Juliet hesitated for a moment. "It's the only thing my mother left me. There's an inscription I've never fully understood." Edward stopped walking, something in his memory trying to surface. "May I see it?" Carefully, Juliet removed the necklace and handed it to him. The partially faded inscription made his heart race. He recognized that handwriting. It was identical to what he had seen in old company documents from an acquisition that had changed his life and apparently Juliet's as well. In Richard's office, Marianne listened intently to the lawyer's revelations. Marcus Sanders owned Sanders Industries. The company was on the verge of revolutionizing the energy sector when the accident happened. His daughter, still a child, was sent to an orphanage, and the company was sold for a fraction of its value. "And what does this have to do with Edward?" Marianne asked, though she already feared the answer. Montgomery Enterprises bought Sanders Industries at the time. It was Edward's first major deal, the one that put him on the corporate world map. Richard paused dramatically. "He didn't know, but the sale was forced. I made sure it looked legal." Back in the gardens, Edward held the necklace as if it were a bomb about to explode. The inscription M.S., Marcus Sanders, the man whose company he had bought 20 years ago, in a deal that had always seemed strangely easy to him. "Juliet," he began, his voice trembling. "Do you remember your father's name?" Before she could answer, Marianne appeared in the garden, her face marked by poorly concealed urgency. "Edward, we need to talk. Now." Lucas continued playing with Max, oblivious to the tensions forming around him. Juliet watched Edward, noticing how his face had paled as he read the inscription on the necklace. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, she felt she was closer to uncovering the truth about her past. But was she ready to face that truth? Edward's office was engulfed in a heavy silence. Marianne had just revealed her findings, and he remained motionless in his leather armchair, Juliet's necklace still in his hands. Marianne's words echoed in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "Sanders Industries. It was my first big deal," he murmured, more to himself than to Marianne. "Eleanor warned me at the time that it seemed too easy. But I was so eager to prove my worth." "Edward," Marianne approached, her voice soft but calculated, "you didn't know. No one knew. Dr. Richard just showed me the documents. The entire process was manipulated to look legitimate." In the garden, Juliet watched Lucas play with Max, trying to control the anxiety consuming her. Edward's reaction upon seeing the necklace had sparked thousands of questions in her mind. Did he know something about her past? About her parents? Mary approached with a tray of lemonade. "You remind me so much of someone," the housekeeper commented, serving a glass to Juliet. There was an old photo of Mrs. Eleanor visiting an orphanage, so there was a girl there who— "Mary," Marianne interrupted sharply, appearing in the garden, "Edward needs you to fetch some documents from the company's central office." The housekeeper quickly walked away, casting one last meaningful glance at Juliet. Marianne sat beside her on the garden bench, maintaining a calculated distance. "Juliet, isn't it? You must be feeling very lucky that Edward took you in like this," Marianne began, her tone seemingly friendly but masking a veiled threat. "He has a big heart, always wanting to help everyone. Sometimes that makes him vulnerable." Juliet felt her body stiffen. "I have no ulterior motives, if that's what you're implying. As soon as I get a job, Lucas and I will leave." "Oh, I'm sure you will." Marianne smiled, but her eyes remained cold. "I'm just worried about Edward. He's already suffered too many losses." In Richard Mendelssohn's office, the lawyer was examining old photographs of the Sanders couple. Marcus and Marina Sanders were smiling in a photo taken in front of their mansion, ironically, not much different from the Montgomery mansion. Beside them, a young Juliet, no more than 5 years old, wearing the same necklace that could now reveal the whole truth. 20 years, Richard murmured to himself. 20 years building a fortune on the ruins of that girl's life. And now, she reappears like a ghost from the past. His phone rang. It was an old contact from the orphanage. "Yes, I found the records you asked for," the voice on the other end informed. "The girl was registered as Juliet Mendelssohn Sanders. There's an interesting note here about a bank account in her name at the National Bank." Richard's heart raced. "The bank account, that's where Marina Sanders had hidden the evidence. I need those documents, now." Back at the mansion, Edward finally left his office. He found Juliet sitting alone in the garden, watching Lucas as he played with Mary by the pool. He approached slowly, feeling the weight of the necklace in his pocket. "Juliet," he called softly. She turned, and Edward felt his heart tighten as he saw her green eyes, the same eyes as Marina Sanders in the old newspaper photo that Marianne had just shown him. "I need to tell you a story," he began, sitting down beside her. "A story about a company called Sanders Industries, and how my pursuit of success might have destroyed a family's life." The moment Edward started speaking, Marianne watched everything from the second-floor window, her phone in hand. "Dr. Richard, he's telling her everything. We need to act fast." In the garden, Juliet listened to Edward with her heart beating faster and faster. Long-buried memories began to surface. Her mother's smile, her father's office overlooking the sea, the day everything changed. "My father," she whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "He was developing something revolutionary, something about clean energy." Edward nodded gravely. "The same technology Ecotech is trying to develop now. Juliet, I don't think it was a coincidence that you showed up that night. Your necklace. The inscription mentions where the sun rises twice. Juliet nodded, confused. Edward continued. Your mother, Marina Sanders, had a vault at the National Bank. The building had two bank logos, one reflecting the morning sun and the other the afternoon sun. It was an inside joke among the employees. The bank where the sun rose twice. Lucas came running over, his innocent laughter cutting through the tension of the moment. Mom, Aunt Mary said we can bake a cake later. Juliet hugged her son, her hands trembling slightly. Edward watched the scene with a lump in his throat. How could he tell her that the company he had bought, the one that had built his fortune, had been stolen from his family through fraudulent documents? The National Bank still stood with its imposing architecture in the heart of New York City, its two massive golden logos gleaming under the afternoon sun. Juliet stared at the building from the window of Edward's car, her heart racing. Lucas had stayed back at the mansion with Mary, engrossed in his new discoveries. "Are you sure you want to do this now?" Edward asked, parking the car. His own voice betrayed the nervousness he felt. "I need to know," Juliet replied simply, clutching the necklace between her fingers. In Richard Mendelssohn's office, the lawyer typed furiously on his computer. His connections at the bank had confirmed it. The safe under Marina Sanders' name still existed, untouched for 20 years. Its contents could destroy not only his reputation, but also that of several powerful people. "I can't let her reach that safe," he muttered to himself, picking up the phone. "Charles? It's me, Richard. I need you to block access to a specific safe, now." Marianne paced restlessly around the office in the Montgomery mansion. The latest analysis from Ecotech showed that the situation was even worse than she had imagined. The technology the company claimed to have developed was actually based on old projects from Sanders Industries, projects that had mysteriously disappeared 20 years ago. How did we not notice this before, she wondered, flipping through documents. That's when she found something interesting. An old photo of Eleanor, Eduardo's late wife, in front of the orphanage. The date caught her attention. It was exactly 1 week after the disappearance of the Sanders family. In the mansion's kitchen, Lucas was helping Mary bake cookies. "My mum is sad," he suddenly commented, surprising the housekeeper. "Why do you say that, dear?" Mary asked, helping him cut the dough. "She cries when she thinks I'm asleep," the boy replied, his innocence making the revelation even more touching. "But here she smiles more. Uncle Edward makes her smile." Mary gently hugged the boy, remembering how Eleanor always said that children saw the truth that adults tried to hide. At the bank, Juliet and Edward were facing a series of bureaucratic obstacles. "I'm sorry," the manager said, clearly uncomfortable, "but I've received explicit orders not to allow access to this specific vault today." "Orders from whom?" Edward questioned, his voice filled with authority. "I am Edward Montgomery, and this lady is the rightful owner of the vault." The manager hesitated, his gaze shifting between a computer screen and the couple in front of him. There's an ongoing legal dispute regarding this vault. I can't—" "There is no dispute," Juliet interrupted, her voice surprisingly firm. For the first time in years, she felt the strength of her true name, her true identity. "I am Juliet Mendelssohn Sanders, daughter of Marcus and Marina Sanders. This safe belongs to my family." The moment she uttered her full name, something shifted in the atmosphere. The manager paled, recognizing the name that, 2 decades ago, was synonymous with power and innovation in New York City. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Marianne received an unexpected visitor. Richard Mendelssohn had arrived without warning, his usually composed face showing genuine concern. "They went to the bank," he said without preamble. "I managed to block access temporarily, but it won't last long. Edward has too much influence." "What exactly is in that safe that has you so nervous, Richard?" Marianne asked, pouring herself a drink. Richard hesitated before answering. "Evidence. Marina Sanders was smarter than we thought. She knew something, was wrong and started investigating. On the day of the accident, she had just deposited a folder of documents in the safe." "What documents?" "Forged contracts, suspicious transfers, recordings. Everything that proves the sale of Sanders Industries was a fraud. Richard ran a hand through his graying hair. If Juliet gets access to this, not only is my career over, but the very legitimacy of Montgomery Enterprises could be called into question. At the bank, after hours of discussions and phone calls, Juliet finally secured authorization to open the safe. As they followed the manager down the hallway leading to the vault room, Edward felt his heart grow heavy. Part of him feared what they would find there, not just for the impact on his business, but for what it would mean for Juliet, for the fragile bond they were beginning to build. "Before we open it," he said, gently holding Juliet's arm, "I need you to know that no matter what we find here, I'm on your side, even if it means losing everything I've built." Juliet looked into his eyes, seeing sincerity where she expected to find fear or guilt. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because some things are more important than money or power," Edward replied, thinking of Lucas, how the boy reminded him of the joy he once dreamed of having with his own children. Because doing the right thing, even if belatedly, is the only way to truly move forward. The safe revealed much more than documents yellowed by time. Inside it, Juliet found pieces of her history she never imagined existed. Alongside the papers her mother had kept, there were photos, letters, and a diary that Marina Sanders had maintained in the last months before the accident. "My mother knew," Juliet murmured, her hands trembling as she flipped through the diary. "She found out everything." Edward watched in silence, feeling the weight of each revelation like a blow to his chest. The documents revealed an elaborate scheme of fraud and manipulation, orchestrated by Richard Mendelsohn, which had led to the hostile takeover of Sanders Industries. "Juliet, he began, but the words seemed inadequate in the face of the magnitude of the situation. "It wasn't your fault," she interrupted, surprising him. "You were deceived too. Look at this." Juliet showed him a letter her mother had written, addressed to Eleanor, Edward's late wife. At the mansion, Lucas played in the garden with Max when Marianne received another call from Richard. "They managed to open the safe." His voice trembled with worry. "We need to act now." "What do you suggest?" Marianne asked, watching the boy through the window. Something in her heart began to weigh heavily. Had she gone too far? "I have a plan," Richard responded, "but I need you to keep Edward occupied. Tonight, I'll prepare some documents that could turn this situation around." At the bank, Juliet continued her discoveries. "My mother wasn't just investigating the company's embezzlement, but also a revolutionary technology my father was developing," she explained to Edward. "The same technology that Ecotech claims to have created." Edward felt his stomach drop. Ecotech, his latest acquisition, was using stolen designs from Sanders Industries. His entire business empire was built on a lie. "I'll fix this," he said firmly, "no matter the cost." Back at the mansion, Juliet found Lucas asleep on the living room couch, exhausted from his playtime. Mary had covered the boy with a blanket and neatly arranged his new toys beside him. "He's very special," Mary commented, approaching Juliet. "You know, Mrs. Eleanor always said that children have a special gift for mending broken hearts." Juliet smiled sadly, stroking her son's hair. "He's the only thing that kept me strong all these years." Edward locked himself in his office, immediately getting to work. He summoned his trusted lawyers and initiated an internal investigation at Ecotech. The findings were increasingly disturbing. The stolen technology from Sanders Industries was just the tip of the iceberg. Marianne watched everything with growing unease. Richard's words echoed in her mind, but something had shifted. Seeing Juliet with Lucas, Edward dedicated to righting past wrongs, she began to question her own motivations. During dinner, the tension was palpable. Juliet barely touched her food, absorbed in thoughts about the day's discoveries. Edward alternated between concerned glances at her and frantic notes on his phone, organizing the next steps to resolve the situation. "Uncle Edward," Lucas's voice broke the silence. "Why are you sad?" The innocent question struck Edward like a bolt of lightning. He looked at the boy, then at Juliet, and felt his eyes well up with tears. "Sometimes, Lucas," he replied with a choked voice. "Adults make mistakes even without meaning to, And when we discover those mistakes, we feel sad, but we also get the chance to fix them. Juliet watched the interaction, her heart tightening. The simplicity with which Edward spoke to Lucas, the honesty in his words, all of it made her see beyond the powerful businessman. She saw a man trying to do the right thing. Later that night, while Lucas slept, Juliet found Edward in the library. He was surrounded by papers, working tirelessly. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, sitting beside him. "You could just try to cover it all up, use your lawyers to dispute the evidence." Edward put down the pen and turned to her. "Because Eleanor taught me that wealth without integrity is worthless, and because—" he hesitated for a moment, "because seeing you and Lucas made me realize that some things are more important than money or power." In Richard's office, the lawyer was feverishly working on his plan. Documents were being altered, dates modified, a new version of the story being constructed. But his hands trembled slightly. For the first time in 20 years, he felt the weight of his choices. At the mansion, Marianne was in her room, rereading old articles about the Sanders accident. One photo in particular caught her attention. Marina Sanders smiling, wearing the same necklace that now belonged to Juliet. In the caption, a phrase that seemed to take on new meaning. "The truth always finds its way back home." The morning arrived with a heavy atmosphere in the Montgomery mansion. Marianne had been in her office since dawn, sifting through old files and documents she had kept for years. On the wall, the clock read 6:30 when she finally made her decision. "I can't be a part of this anymore," she murmured to herself, staring. At her phone screen, where an unanswered message from Richard blinked. The lawyer had spent the night sending increasingly desperate instructions on how they should proceed to cover up Juliet's discoveries. In the garden, Juliet watched the sunrise with Lucas asleep in her lap. The revelations from the previous day still echoed in her mind, but now there was something different, a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. "You're up early," Edward's voice sounded softly behind her. He carried 2 cups of coffee and had deep bags under his eyes, signs of a sleepless night. "Lucas had a nightmare," Juliet explained, accepting the cup he offered. "He dreamed we had to leave." Edward sat beside them on the garden bench. "And do you need to go?" The question hung in the morning air, laden with unspoken meanings. Before Juliet could answer, they were interrupted by Mary, who arrived in a hurry. "Mr. Edward, Marianne needs to speak with you. She says it's urgent." In the office, Marianne waited for them with an expression that mixed determination and vulnerability. On her desk was a thick folder of documents and her open laptop. "I need to confess something," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "And I need to do it before it's too late." Juliet sat down, still holding the sleeping Lucas in her arms, while Edward remained standing, tense. Marianne took a deep breath before continuing. "I knew. Not from the beginning, but a few years ago I discovered the truth about Sanders Industries. Richard told me when he needed my help to cover up some suspicious transactions." Edward felt as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I was in love with you," Marianne replied, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "After Eleanor left, I thought I'd finally have my chance. But then Juliet appeared and I saw how you look at her. It's the same look you had with Eleanor." Juliet watched the scene in silence, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Marianne continued, opening her notebook. "Richard is planning to use forged documents to invalidate the evidence you found in the vault. He has connections at the bank, the police, everywhere, but—" She turned the computer screen so they could see. "I saved copies of everything. Every email, every document, every conversation that proves the fraud." On the other side of the city, Richard received the news he feared most. His contact at the bank had just informed him that the evidence from the vault had already been digitized and sent to multiple recipients. "It's over, Richard," the voice on the phone said. "There's no covering this up now." Back at the mansion, Edward processed Marianne's revelations. Years of friendship and trust had been tainted by the lie, but there was also a chance for redemption in her actions now. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Why now?" Marianne looked at Lucas, who was starting to wake up in Juliet's arms. Because some things are more important than unrequited love or power. Because Eleanor would have done the same thing. Juliet adjusted Lucas in her lap, who was now watching the scene with sleepy eyes. "What happens now?" she asked, her calm voice surprising everyone. "Now," Edward replied, placing a hand on Juliet's shoulder, "we start fixing everything. The technology your father developed, the projects that were stolen. We're going to recover it all. And this time we'll do it the right way." Marianne stood up, gathering the documents. "I have a meeting with the district attorney in an hour. I'm going to hand over all the evidence, admit my involvement, and testify against Richard. You don't have to do this alone," Edward said, surprising her. "I'll go with you. I also have my share of responsibility in all this." Lucas, now fully awake, looked at his mother with curious eyes. "Mum, are we still going to live here?" The innocent question brought tears to Juliet's eyes. Edward stepped closer, crouching down to the boy's level. "If your mother allows it," he said, looking into Juliet's eyes, "this will always be your home." Marianne watched the scene, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. She had lost her chance with Edward, but she had gained something more valuable, the opportunity to do the right thing. In the garden, Max barked happily at the first rays of sunlight breaking through the trees. Mary, watching everything from her kitchen window, smiled. As Eleanor used to say, sometimes you have to lose everything to find what truly matters. The meeting room at the public ministry was filled with tension when Richard Mendelsohn arrived, summoned to provide explanations. His confident expression faltered upon finding not only the prosecutors, but also Edward, Juliet, and Marianne waiting for his arrival. "What is this? An ambush?" he asked, his usual arrogance giving way to poorly concealed nervousness. "This, Dr. Richard," replied Prosecutor Diana Alvarez, "is the moment of truth." At the Montgomery mansion, Lucas played with Max under Mary's watchful care. The boy had insisted on staying with the housekeeper, saying he needed to take care of the house while the adults handled important matters. "Your mother would be proud," Mary smiled, observing how Lucas meticulously organized his toys. "You're very much like her." In the meeting room, the documents found in the Sanders safe were presented one by one. Richard paled with each new revelation, while Marianne, seated next to Juliet, supplemented the information with her own records. "The projects from Sanders Industries didn't simply disappear," Marianne explained, her voice steady. "They were stolen and stored, waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered by Ecotech." Edward, who had remained silent until then, stood up. "As president of Montgomery Enterprises, I take full responsibility for the fraudulent acquisition of Sanders Industries. I am here to correct this mistake and ensure that justice is served." Richard let out a nervous laugh. "Don't you understand? It was a business deal like any other. The market is like this, it always has been." "No," Juliet interrupted, her voice heavy with restrained emotion. "The market isn't like that. My father believed in honest innovation, in progress that benefited everyone. You didn't just steal a company, you stole dreams, lives, futures." Richard's lawyer tried to intervene, but he was cut off by more revelations. Marianne presented emails, recordings, and documents she had collected over the years, weaving a web that was impossible to deny. "Why now, Marianne?" Richard asked, his voice almost a whisper. "After all this time?" "Because I learned that true love isn't about possession or power," she replied, glancing briefly at Edward. "It's about doing the right thing even when it hurts." At the mansion, Lucas had convinced Mary to bake cookies. As the dough baked, filling the kitchen with a comforting aroma, the boy talked about his dreams. "When I grow up," he said, "I want to be like Uncle Edward and help people. But I also want to be a scientist like my grandfather." Mary smiled, surprised. "How do you know about your grandfather?" "I heard Mom saying he invented things to help the planet. Is it true that he was really smart?" Back at the district attorney's office, the meeting reached its crucial moment. Richard, cornered by the evidence, finally began to speak. He revealed names, dates, operations, a conspiracy that went beyond Sanders Industries. "You know what's ironic?" he said suddenly. "Looking aged. The technology that Marcus Sanders developed could have revolutionized the clean energy sector 20 years ago. How many lives could we have improved? Edward looked at Juliet, seeing in her eyes the same determination he had seen in Marcus Sanders in old photos. "We can still do this," he said. "The plans still exist. Your father's vision can become a reality." Prosecutor Diana made her final notes. Richard would be indicted, along with others involved in the scheme. Montgomery Enterprises would face significant restructuring, but with a commitment to right the wrongs of the past. At the end of the meeting, as everyone was leaving, Richard made one last comment. "Juliet, your mother knew. She found out everything and tried to confront me. I'm sorry." Juliet didn't respond, but clutched the necklace between her fingers. She finally understood why her mother had chosen that specific safe, that cryptic message. It was a final act of love and protection. On the way back to the mansion, the car was silent. Edward drove, occasionally glancing at Juliet in the passenger seat. Marianne had followed in her own car, needing to sort out matters with her lawyers. "What are you thinking about?" Edward asked softly. "About how life takes unexpected turns," Juliet replied, a small smile forming on her lips. "A week ago, Lucas and I were on the streets. Now we're helping to rebuild my family's legacy. And this is just the beginning," Edward commented, his hand finding hers on the car's center console. "If you want to, of course." Juliet intertwined her fingers with his, feeling the strength and comfort of that simple gesture. "Lucas already considers this place his home," she said, "and I'm starting to feel the same way too." When they arrived at the mansion, they were greeted by the aroma of freshly baked cookies and Lucas's joyful laughter. In the kitchen, they found the boy and Mary covered in flour, proudly presenting their creations. "We made them to celebrate," Lucas exclaimed. Mary said today was a special day. Edward picked up a still warm cookie, sharing a knowing look with Juliet. "Yes, champ, today is a very special day. It's the day we start building something new, all together." 6 months had passed since Richard's confession. The New Dawn Institute, now renamed the Sanders-Montgomery Institute, gleamed under the morning sun of New York City. The facilities had been expanded, and at the center of the complex, a new renewable energy research lab was beginning its operations. Juliet, dressed in an elegant executive suit, gazed out the window of her office as a group of children played in the Institute's courtyard. Among them, Lucas ran with the other kids, his smile lighting up the place like a little sun. "Thinking." "About your father?" Edward asked, entering the room with 2 cups of coffee. "Yes," she smiled, accepting the cup. "He always said that true innovation comes from the desire to make the world better for future generations." The laboratory was just the beginning. With the merger of Montgomery Enterprises and what remained of Sanders Industries, a new company was born, focused not only on profits but also on sustainable development and social responsibility. Marianne, who had chosen to remain as a consultant for the group, entered the room carrying a folder of documents. Over the past few months, she had become a valuable ally in the restructuring of the companies, and her friendship with Juliet had grown surprisingly strong. "The applications for the scholarship program have exceeded all expectations," she announced. 300 children will benefit next semester. The program was Juliet's personal initiative to provide quality education for children from underprivileged communities, with a special focus on science and technology. It was her way of honoring not only the memory of her parents, but also all the children who, like her, had lost their chances in the past. Mary entered the room, holding Lucas by the hand. The boy was excited, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "Mum, Dad, you have to see what we did in science class today," he exclaimed, naturally calling Edward Dad, as he had started doing a few months ago. Edward crouched down to the boy's level, his heart filling with love upon hearing that word. Lucas's adaptation to their new life had been surprisingly smooth, as if somehow they were always meant to be a family. "How about showing us after lunch?" Juliet suggested. "We have a surprise for you first." In the Institute's meeting room, a small celebration had been prepared. It was the day Lucas would officially become a Montgomery Sanders, the adoption finally approved after months of process. "I thought I was already part of the family," Lucas commented innocently, making everyone laugh. "And you always were, champ," Edward replied, hugging the boy. "This is just so the rest of the world knows too." Juliet watched the scene, her mother's necklace still around her neck, now accompanied by a golden wedding band. Her marriage to Edward had been an intimate ceremony in the mansion's garden, with Lucas as the ring-bearer and Max carrying the rings. Mariana approached Juliet, handing her an envelope. "I found this in the old archives. I thought you might want to see it." It was an old photo, Marcus and Marina Sanders standing in front of the company's first laboratory, embracing and smiling. Juliet felt tears well up in her eyes as she saw the happiness etched on her parents' faces. "They would be proud," Mariana said softly, "of everything you've built, of everything you've become." In the courtyard of the Institute, during the small celebration that followed, Lucas played with his new friends while the adults chatted. Max ran around among the children, his tail wagging joyfully. "You know," Edward remarked, wrapping his arms around Juliet from behind as they watched the scene. "When Eleanor left, I thought I'd never be happy again, that I'd lost my chance at having a family." Juliet turned in his arms, looking into his eyes. "And I thought I'd never have a place to call home again, that Lucas and I would always be alone." "And now?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Now we have everything," she replied, kissing him gently. "A family, a purpose, a future." Mary approached the couple carrying a photo album. "I found this morning," she said, opening it to a specific page. It was a photo of Eleanor at the orphanage, and there was Juliet, a girl with bright green eyes in the background of the picture. "She used to say that girl had something special," Mary commented. "That one day she would make a difference in the world." Lucas ran up to them, interrupting the moment with his infectious energy. "Dad, Mom, can I show my science project now?" The project, as they discovered, was a small solar-powered generator, built with the help of his teachers. Julia's eyes filled with tears as she saw the same passion for innovation that her father had shining in her son's eyes. As the sun set, over the Sanders Montgomery Institute, casting golden shadows over the new beginning they had built together, Julia thought about how right her mother had been. The truth always finds its way back home, and sometimes it brings with it far more than we expect. "Where are we going now?" Lucas asked, holding his parents' hands. "Forward," Edward replied, smiling. "Always forward, together." And so, under the New York City sky, a new family celebrated not only the love that had brought them together, but also the legacy of hope and transformation they were building. A legacy that, like the sun rising twice over the bank building, would shine forever in the lives they touched.